Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to this seminar, which is part of our Human Rights Seminar Series, organized by the Center for Comparative and Public Law, the Human Rights Hub, also in the faculty. And I also want to note that this is part of a series during this academic year in celebration of the 20th anniversary of the LLM in Human Rights program in the Faculty of Law. I'm very pleased today to be able to introduce Professor Surya Deva, who will be speaking on what's clearly a very timely, important issue on the responsibilities of corporations with regard to the current protest in Hong Kong. And I'm actually going to read out the entire title because I really like the title that he chose. I'm constantly striving to come up with creative, interesting, appropriate titles for my own work, and I'm never successful. But I like this very much because he uses good alliteration. So it's the Hong Kong Protests and Corporations, Navigating Through Profit, Principles, and Pressure. Professor Deva teaches at the City University School of Law. He's also a member of the UN Working Group on Business and Human Rights and has been since 2016 when he was appointed by the Human Rights Council. He has done extensive research in the area of business and human rights and also on economic, social, and cultural rights, sustainable development, Indian and Chinese constitutional law. He has advised numerous bodies, UN bodies, civil society organizations, multinational corporations, governments on business and human rights matters. He's also one of the founding editors-in-chief of the Business and Human Rights Journal, published by Cambridge University Press, and sits on the board of a number of other prominent international human rights publications. I can't think of anyone better to be here today to speak with us on this critical topic. So please join me in welcoming Professor Deva.
Thank you very much, Kelly, for this very kind introduction, and thank you everyone for coming for this talk. So as you will see from the title, I think this issue is under-discussed and under-explored. When we're talking about the autonomy of Hong Kong, the situation of democracy, most of the time we are not talking about the private sector's role. And I think in this seminar, hopefully, I will try to expose that how critical is their role. And so I will briefly talk about the context so that you understand from where I'm coming. And I will mention concrete cases of a number of companies which are somehow connected in one way or the other way in the Hong Kong current protests. Then I will try to highlight in this particular context how this shift is taking place at a normative level between the idea of profit maximization to this idea that you can, of course, make profit, but this profit should be with certain principles. And here, human rights will definitely be part of those principles. And then moving on, I would like to bring in the pressure that has been exerted on some of these companies. And I will take two companies, MTR and Cathay Pacific, as a concrete example that how they have responded to pressure coming from Chinese authorities, and their actions and decisions, are they in line with international human rights norms? So that is the argument I'm going to make. I would also have some suggestions for these companies, again, what they could have done differently, which could have, in my view, struck a better balance between making profit as well as respecting human rights. So let us start with the broad context. So you'll have some pictures. Hopefully you would like them. So on this slide, if you compare and contrast 2014 with 2019 in Hong Kong, there are many differences. But for the purpose of this talk, the difference which is quite critical for me is that the corporations operating in Hong Kong, and these could be corporations, local corporations or Chinese companies, or these could be multinationals having offices in Hong Kong, they have come under tremendous direct pressure from the Chinese authorities. And I'm using Chinese authorities in a broad sense to cover even, let us say, Chinese media, which is speaking the language of the Chinese government. So a range of factors are putting pressure on these corporations that they have to take a stand. And the stand basically is that you follow the party line. So if you do not follow the party line, you are not with us. So either you are with us or you are against us. And against us could be anything in this particular context. Of course, you see the picture of the chief executive officer of Cathay Pacific, but you also see some statements, like this is the media statement issued by PricewaterhouseCoopers. So you'll see again that they are issuing statements, and that is the contrast that provides the context for my talk, in my view. Now let us take a number of concrete situations how different companies could get involved in this discourse on business and human rights, as we often talk about it. I think one is that police anywhere in the world is hardly manufacturing weapons. So these are provided mostly by private companies. In the context of Hong Kong police, the two major sourcing countries are US and UK. So a number of companies operating from these countries are providing a variety of crowd control measures. And more recently, even Chinese companies are providing these materials to Hong Kong police force. And I think that is, as I will talk later, this is directly an issue that the companies have to consider, as well as Hong Kong police has to consider from where they are sourcing these materials and whether there are any human rights implications for that. The second example I already mentioned, Cathay Pacific, is that there are a number of situations in which they have dismissed their employees. They have, in fact, encouraged their employees to spy on each other and report whether any employee is posting any material on social media. There have been those instances. And, of course, even a trade union leader has been dismissed. So this is quite significant range of actions taken by this company, which are inconsistent with the human rights responsibilities, as I will try to argue. The third instance I would like to give is, you may have seen the newspaper report that Hong Kong police has obtained a court order to provide them this data about the octopus transactions. And this company has been requested that you must provide this information that allows them to identify who are these people who took a particular bus on a particular time and day. So this is, again, the issue which many lawyers may think, oh, there is a court order, and that's why the company has to provide this data. And as I will try to show, yes, that is there, but that order does not mean that this bus company can totally ignore its human rights responsibilities. It has to balance that as well. Now, moving on, I'm sure you have heard of some social media companies also playing a role, getting involved. And of course, both sides are using social media quite actively. Now, the question is that how and what role these social media companies have when it comes to the Hong Kong protests, ongoing or in future or in the past. And of course, these companies have deactivated some certain accounts. They have also made a policy decision that they're not going to take the advertisement from Chinese government and all this. So this is, again, something which is relevant. Now, a more recent phenomena, relatively recent, I would say, is the U-turn by MTR. Now, as you may have seen closely, MTR was a company which was, if not encouraging, they were tolerating protesters. They were not pushing the protesters out. They were tolerating protesters, and of course that immediately changed after some news reports came in the People's Daily, the newspaper, that how could a company be complicit? How could this MTR, which is in fact in a unique situation, and that is a distinction we should be aware. Cathay Pacific is not what we will call a government-owned or controlled company, but MTR is different. This is a company which has a close nexus and connection with the Hong Kong SAR government. So their responsibility, I will argue, is higher than Cathay Pacific when it comes to human rights responsibilities. So what are the implications of MTR closing certain stations beforehand, when even if the protest is authorized? if you know Hong Kong well, probably you should know better than me, MTR is quite good in crowd management. If you look at the fireworks around New Year and anything, they manage crowd very well. And they have managed crowd in many protests in Hong Kong very well. So what happened suddenly that they have to shut down their stations in advance, even if the protest is legally authorized by the authorities. Of course, you may think that these are issues about civil and political rights alone, but no. There could be implications for each and every human right and social, economic, and cultural rights. Every right is at stake when it comes to business and human rights. And because of the lack of the number of tourists in Hong Kong, the hotels, many hotels are complaining and saying, these employees who have been working for us, they must go on unpaid leave. And that has, of course, an implication for their right to livelihood. But a more concrete case, I would say, is about which we often do not talk about in the context of business and human rights, is the unaffordable housing in Hong Kong. And this is the data I got only from SCMP yesterday. So you will see here that with the exception of 2017 and 18, you will see that most of the time, these business tycoons, they have a huge amount of land with them, but they are not building houses. They're waiting for the right time to make maximum profit out of that land, how they can do it. And also, even if they have built certain flats and houses, they're not selling all of them. They're keeping it. So again, their idea is driven by making maximum profit, and that's why you will see in this chart that it has become almost unaffordable to buy anything. Forget about young students graduating out of a law school. Even for a person who is teaching at Hong Kong University, I don't know what Cali, but I cannot buy. I have to think, can I really buy anything in Hong Kong? And that's why, so this has definitely some relevance to the protests and the lack of hope that these young people see. At the same time, I would like to add a footnote here, and the footnote is that the new narrative of Beijing and some pro-establishment people in Hong Kong is that, okay, give them housing, everything will be fine. And then this is a wrong impression. This is a badly mistaken view. So people in Hong Kong are definitely looking for affordable housing, but they also want civil and political rights. They also want universal suffrage. So it's not either or. So this idea or this impression or narrative that give them housing and they will just go back home and live happily and not complain about their rights, in my view, this is a mistaken belief. So this is a broad context within which I'm going to make this argument. So what should companies do? I mean, of course, the easy thinking might be that they have to just make money. That is what the companies are for, right? Some of you may also think that what is new about it? I'm sure you have heard of the British East India Company, right? Because that company had a connection with the colonization of Hong Kong as well. And this recent book document, there are many books which talking about British East India Company and its empire, how it operated, how it violated human rights. But this more recent book again articulates this, and this is an example I'm taking here, that what is happening and what companies are doing now is nothing new or unique. We have been seeing this for more than 400 years, that these companies are being used by different political powers to further their agenda. And that could be definitely inconsistent with the idea of human rights. Despite that, I think it will be a fair assessment to say that in the last 3 or 4 decades, the normative landscape had changed quite a lot. I mean, we have those scholarly debates in 1930s between these two very famous professors, Burleigh and Dodd, based at Columbia and Harvard, that what is the purpose of the corporation? Is the purpose to make profit, the maximum of it? Or should companies be regarded as social purpose as well? That has been the part of the debate. And of course, the famous economist Milton Friedman famously or infamously argued that the only responsibility of a company is to maximize profit. So any idea which deviates from making more and more profit is inconsistent with this. So I think that has been the typical old idea of the corporation, And increasingly, that idea is changing. And I can give multiple examples of it, but I would like to cite this concrete example, and these are not my words. This is a statement adopted last month by about 200 leading corporations in the US. So chief executive officers of these leading 200 companies came together, and this statement is clearly saying that what is the purpose of a company? And on this slide, probably I don't know if you can read it. Hopefully you can, but it's available online as well. So you'll see that they're talking about not merely shareholders. They're specifically referring to employees, they're referring to customers, they're referring to the communities at stake. So basically, companies are being forced, in my view, to take a position that we make profit, and in the process of making profit, we also promote and further human rights. There's nothing wrong with making profit and wealth maximization. But the point is, if the sole purpose of any company is to make profit anyway, then let us bring back the slavery. They can make more profit. Companies will make more profit if we bring in artificial intelligence. Fire all the employees in a factory. You just need 5 people. Fire 950 people, right? We can make more money. Robots do not demand pregnancy benefits. They don't. Once you invest in robots, you don't have to. They don't sue you for child labor. They don't argue for disability discrimination, right? So I mean, are we going to go for that model? So I think that is a debate which is going on and becoming more and more prominent in my view. And I think in this context, some of you in the room, I'm sure, are fully aware of the UN guiding principles, but for the benefit of everyone, these UN guiding principles were adopted by the Human Rights Council in June 2011. They are not legally binding, as I will say on the next slide, but they're very, very important normative documents. They're highly persuasive, and they talk about the duty, of course, of the governments. And here the duties are of the governments which are the host countries. In this context, it will be Hong Kong SAR government and the Chinese government, but also, very importantly, duties of the home government. So if Cathay Pacific and Surya has a presence in the UK government has a duty to ensure that Surya and Cathay Pacific does not breach human rights operating in Hong Kong. So it's not merely the responsibility or duty of the Hong Kong SAR government to ensure that. I think it is the responsibility which is shared between the home countries and the host countries. That is what we talk about, the Pillar 1 of the UN Guiding Principles. Pillar 2 is that all businesses have a responsibility which is differentiated from duty legally binding to a responsibility which is social expectation to respect all rights. And I think this is very powerful because you are not making any distinction between certain rights that you have to respect and some other rights you don't have to respect. So it basically captures all labor rights, all human rights, environmental rights, rights of the spatial groups, indigenous communities. Every right is included. And of course, all businesses are included, not merely multinationals and everything. And of course, there has to be some effective remedies at the end of it. As I mentioned to you, the UN guiding principles are not legally binding. And I think that is, hope some of you are lawyers or law students here. And I think that is, law schools are failing. I will be very candid about it. That we are teaching them black letter law, and these lawyers will not be able to advise their clients' companies if they merely advise based on legal provisions. You have to look at non-legally binding norms which are evolving if you have to give an effective advice to your clients. And that's why these UN guiding principles are highly critical and important. If you are a lawyer and you have to give an advice, and Anthony is sitting here, he's a lawyer, and I'm sure he can share more on that. So what are the UNGPs are asking for? In a way, they're asking for not much. It looks very simple. They're basically asking all businesses to respect all human rights, which basically means you may think as a negative responsibility to avoid infringing human rights. And they should do what I will explain later, human rights due diligence to mitigate, to prevent those abuses. But if companies end up abusing certain rights, then they have a responsibility to address those adverse impacts, which could mean access to remedy in the context of human rights language. So they have to provide those remedies as well. So under the UN guiding principles, every company, not just the big ones, every company, even a small shops from where you buy a sandwich, every company is expected to do three things. First, make a policy commitment. Of course, if you are a big company, the policy commitment should be detailed, developed in consultation with everyone. It should be posted on the website. But if you are a small company, still you could make a simple statement by posting a A4 size poster that we don't discriminate and things like this, right? So policy commitment is the starting point. Every company is expected to do that. Then how do you move from paper to practice? Once you make a commitment, how do you put this commitment into practice? And here, this idea of HRDD, human rights due diligence, becomes crucial. And the final is the remediation, which I already mentioned. Now, what is this human rights due diligence? I mean, I might need more than an hour to explain what this is, but very briefly, this is a 4-step cycle where each company has to start by what we know as impact assessment. They have to do an impact assessment that how their operations, their actions, their decisions are impacting anyone, maybe sitting in this room, maybe outside, positively or negatively, those people. Once you're able to make that assessment, you need to integrate those findings into your things. Let us say a company finds that we do not have enough women in the board of directors. We do not have enough women as managers. I mean, this is a typical issue in a textile industry. 80% of the workers are women. Managers, hardly any women. So if a company identifies this gender gap, right, then they have to identify how they can fix this. They have to integrate those findings. And then they have to track their responses. They cannot fix everything overnight. So if Cathay Pacific or MTR are facing these human rights challenges, they may not be able to fix everything in 1 week. And that is not what we are expecting. But you should have a plan of action. What are we going to do now? What are we going to do next 6 months? What are we going to do in next 2 years? What will be our way forward about it? And of course, which companies don't see any critical point is you need to communicate what you're doing, or what you are not doing, or what you cannot do. This is very critical, because then it is about the engagement with the stakeholders. So these are the 4 steps which are very critical. I will not have the time to go into in detail about the 3 ways in which companies can contribute to adverse impact. So under the UN guiding principles, this typology is called you can cause, and this is the most serious. So if a company is directly causing an adverse impact, and I think the adverse impact here could be caused, let us say, Cathay Pacific. If Cathay Pacific has dismissed its workers simply because they posted something on Facebook, they are causing adverse impact on human rights directly. This is the most serious situation. MTR would fall into this contribute. Now, people can go to a protest site even without taking MTR. But if MTR has decided to shut certain stations next to a protest site, it is contributing and discouraging and disabling those protesters to go to the protest site and exercise their human rights. And I think this is something like this. The universal suffrage is allowed, but we impose a curfew. So everyone can vote. You have a right to vote, but you cannot go to the polling station, right? So if tomorrow bus services, ferry services, taxis, everyone stops operating because there's a protest. So you can protest. Police has given you no objection, but you can't go there. You have to go back to 2 centuries back, and you have to walk to the protest site, or you have to swim the harbor to go to the protest site, right? So those are regions good for climate change, I would say, right? And good for our health. But for the corporations, I think these are the things they have to consider. The 2 other points which are absolutely relevant for this context. Businesses have to understand that merely complying with regulations is not enough. Of course, they have to comply with local regulations, whether they are coming from mainland China or coming from local Hong Kong authorities. They have to do it. That is non-negotiable. But on top of that, they also have to comply with UN guiding principles, and I will concretely show how they can do it. And the last point on the slide is critical. And this critical issue is that what if there is a conflict between a legal provision and the UN guiding principles? What if the Chinese government says, fire all the pilots who are participating in protests? And your UN guiding principles saying, no, you cannot do it. How could you balance it, right? So one simple solution could be follow the law, make profit, right? But the guiding principles are telling companies no. And the crucial thing here is seek ways. Can companies be innovative to respect both the regulations as well as the UN guiding principles? I mean, that is the normative framework. Now let us try to move on and to see the pressure. I mean, and that is a very interesting dimension for me, where the foreign minister of a country openly says that the companies have to hold the Chinese flag. That is, of course, for a corporate lawyer, issues about corporate governance. But from my perspective, from a human rights perspective, this is a very serious red line that has been crossed. That you are undermining the autonomy, the free market economy, the liberal economy idea, that the companies have to follow what the government is telling them. Whether right or wrong, that is a separate question. How could the governments tell like this without a legal provision that you have to follow and hold up and be patriotic, right? So basically, what used to be that everyone who wants to become a LegCo member or hold an office in Hong Kong has to love the country. Now even companies have to love the country. And what that loving the country could mean could be anything. So these are, again, how the companies have reacted to this pressure that has been exerted, right? So the companies and the business tycoons have given huge newspaper advertisements saying that we uphold basic law, we respect one country, two system, but we don't like these protesters and protests. Are these protests not about basic law and upholding the one country and two system? So there's a huge contradiction in what they are saying. So they see these protests against the basic law, against one country, two system. But the very reason of these protests is the basic law and these people. Then the U-turns. Now this is the precise statement given by the chairperson of Cathay Pacific before he resigned. So he said, we have these 20,000 plus employees. How can we monitor and tell these employees what they can put on Facebook and Twitter and other WeChat and all this? How can they regulate the private lives of these employees so effectively and tell them, right? And of course, the U-turn, everyone knows what happened after that, right? And the MTR position I already mentioned to you, that once the newspaper reports came in Chinese newspapers, then MTR suddenly became a different company. This started shutting down stations in advance, getting in a court injunction. But at the same time, if you want to think it and reflect from even a profit-making perspective, has this change in approach of MTR been effective? Has police been able to protect MTR? Has MTR even been able to protect itself? No. This is a good contrast with, so even if you change a policy, can you change it in a way which at least gives you more profit? So MTR is not able to going to make more profit now. And of course, they are not able to respect human rights responsibility. So they're neither here nor there. So that creates this particular paradox. Now, this is Cathay Pacific. And these are the words in their code of conduct, which they would like everyone to follow. And it's very clearly that we will not discriminate against anyone merely on the basis of political opinion. So how can you reconcile this code of conduct, which says that you will not discriminate on the basis, and then fire employees, including pilots and trade union leaders, simply because they are protesting in what they consider illegal protest? All the protests are not illegal. How do you differentiate? What evidence do you have? What is overly radical? They say this word, overly radical. What is radical? What is overly? And how do you reconcile this with what you say in your code of conduct, right? And look at this paragraph. They are continuously striving to adopt workplace practices that respect international human rights law, right? So they want to go higher and higher. So rather than aspiring to go better and better in terms of human rights, Cathay has gone backwards and not even following what its principles are. This is my last concrete situation. So you have the chief executive officer of MTR on record saying that we should be hiring Gurkhas because they don't speak Cantonese. They will not understand abuse, right? So you have the Hong Kong SAR government, which is using or misusing police as its line of defense. And now you have MTR replicating that model and using these Gurkhas to protect MTR and disregarding their individual identity and their rights, and using explicitly this assumption that they may not understand Cantonese. Some Nepalese do understand Cantonese. They have been born here. So this is, again, a reflection of the discriminatory mindset of these leaders of businesses in Hong Kong, but this can be replicated anywhere else. So let me move towards what else or what differently could they have done. In my view, and I will take the specific situations of MTR and Cathay Pacific, they could have done things differently. And that's where 3 Ps become relevant. Of course, they have to make profit, and no one is disputing it. Of course, they have to follow the rules and regulations, which could be including the pressure coming from Beijing. If they want to operate in China, they have to fly to and from China. They have to use the Chinese space. They have to follow those regulations. But can they completely forget the principles? It seems that is what they're doing. And I will try to show that they can follow all these 3 together. How? There are 4 Cs. My first C is consultative impact assessment. This is my first C. So these companies should have consulted that, okay, Beijing is asking us to follow these new regulations. So Cathay Pacific could have consulted its employees. They have 25,000 plus employees. They don't merely fly to China and over China. They could have done the internal survey. Which employees are comfortable to fly to Beijing? Not every of 25,000 plus employees are protesting and on the streets, right? So if the company wanted, they could have simply made this internal policy decision. They could have had this conversation with the employees and found out who will be the right employees, which would allow us to comply with the Beijing regulation at the same time comply with the human rights responsibilities. But of course, they have not done that. So the first critical point is this consultation. Who are going to be impacted? Similarly, MTR, are they talking to customers, right? So not everyone who is impacted is a protester. People also use MTR for non-protesting regions. Has MTR consulted them? That is not happening. And that shows the frustration on the part of the customers. They need to consult. This is my first C. The second C is creative compliance. And lawyers always give them ideas. How can companies comply, but comply creatively? If Chinese government would like Cathay Pacific to give certain amount of millions of dollars in tax there, do you think Cathay Pacific is going to transfer the money next 1 hour? They will not. They will use whatever they want to avoid paying that tax. So companies are very much used to creative compliance. So could they have complied with the regulations of Beijing, these authorities? Again, the question is, the authority is about safety. They cannot impose any regulations. Of course, the legitimate interest is that the Cathay has to ensure that the safety of the flights, the people, the passengers, everyone is there, right? That is a legitimate expectation, and that is their goal, and they could issue regulations on that. But can they cross that line and start asking anything and everything? Can Beijing tomorrow say that no protester should board a Cathay flight? Why? Because every protester is a potential threat to safety. They can hijack the plane. Will Cathay do that? Will it stop flying and do the screening and ask a certificate, certify that you have not participated in any of the protests in the last 3 months, otherwise you cannot use Cathay Pacific? Will they do that? That is the question companies should be asking. My third C is collaborative action. China is powerful, but companies are powerful too. And they can become more powerful if they act together. And that is what the UN Guiding Principles expect. They expect companies to use leverage. And sometimes that leverage is more if you work collectively together. And companies do that all the time. On this slide, you see a very concrete example. So it's not Cathay Pacific alone, but 70 airlines coming together and making a representation to the Hong Kong government. We are suffering, waive this. This is collaborative action. If one airline goes to the government may not listen. So if all the companies which are flying over Chinese space come together and negotiate with Beijing, will it be better or not? In my view, that is what they should be doing. Sometimes you negotiate and you make it public. Even if you have to follow regulations, you at least take a stand that we are complying with it, but we are uncomfortable with this compliance. We resist this, and we very much hope and encourage the Chinese government to change its policies. Did they do that? No. That is what they should have done. My fourth and the last point is remediation, compensation. Now, C is merely compensation, but I'm using here C in a wide sense, that if whatever you have to do that has resulted in adverse impact on those employees in the context of Cathay, that they have been fired, you can't just dismiss them simply because Beijing is asking you to do that. Or even if you have to do that, then you have to work with them to ensure that they have a livelihood, that they are compensated for the 10 years or 20 years that they have spent in Cathay Pacific. If MTR is closing stations and it thinks that is the best option and the only option it has, then it has also considered the adverse impact on the customers, whether protesting or non-protesting ones. What can it do? And I think they have to think creatively what remediation may look in those particular situations. So let me conclude. I think I was focusing on a particular context, but these implications I'm drawing are very broad and wide implications from these case studies that I'm looking at. My first point is that human rights scholars, students, lawyers, civil society, everyone, they should come out of their basket of thinking human rights in relation to only the government and the state. They have to look carefully this nexus between the government and the private sector. Because many human rights abuses and violations are closely connected with the private sector. And in many cases, the line between the government and the private sector is not very clear. I give a very concrete example, the Belt and the Road Initiative. Is this a government initiative? Is this a private initiative? Is it both? What impact this is going to have not just on China, but all over the world. And that is why the constitutional law scholars, the human rights law scholars, and the lawyers, and civil societies and trade unions, everyone have to think creatively, how can we ensure respect of human rights when the private sector is involved? I think that is a larger implication we should be looking at. My second prediction is that increasingly there will be demands, and I think that is a good contrast with my first slide. In 2014, companies were not compelled to take a position. Companies were involved in 2014 protests as well, positively or negatively. But the Chinese government did not put them on a spot that either you are with us or you are against us. This has been happening now, and I see more and more of this happening in future because that is what the British government did in the 1600s. The British government in 1600 gave a charter to this company, British East India Company, and used that company to rule many parts, including India. And the colonization in Hong Kong is linked to that same company. This company in India, during its peak, had more army than the British government. So what we see here is that it is very, very likely that the Chinese government is likely to use more and more the private sector, the state-owned enterprises, and other companies like Cathay Pacific, they will be put under pressure to follow what the government would like to do. So that is a question for all of us, a question for companies. How are we going to respond to that challenge in future? And my last point is that we often talk about one country, two system. We talk about human rights and democracy and universal suffrage. But we do not think of companies when we talk about these issues in Hong Kong. Do we have less democracy in Hong Kong? Are we not having universal suffrage because of business tycoons out there? Do they have a legitimate interest in this? Do they have vested interest in not having universal suffrage in Hong Kong? These are the questions we should be asking. But more importantly, and let me stop perhaps on a more positive note, can you convince these companies and bring them on your side? Can you make these companies supporters of, as has happened about extradition law? Many companies and chambers of commerce openly gave a statement that we do not like this idea of an extradition law. So here you see the private power is supporting the language of human rights. In the past, it has happened about LGBTI rights issues. Law firms and companies openly said, we want no discrimination against LGBTI community. So there are possibilities, there are windows, there are openings. And I think we have to be creative to ensure that not every company, but some companies in the private sectors are speaking our language of human rights if we have to win this battle. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. We do have some time for questions and comments. If anyone has any. Elizabeth?
Thank you. I think it's a very timely and very useful presentation. My question is, you've talked a lot about what businesses should do about it, but what about us as customers or those who are not really, we don't really have stake in the businesses? Is there anything that we can do? Would boycotting big corporations work? Would that amount to certain amount of pressure that could make corporations think twice before they compromise?
Okay, I think we'll take a couple of more questions before Professor Deva answers. And any other? Yes?
I'll preface the question with a little bit of commentary, because I think one of the interesting things about...
Sorry, could I ask you to push the button next to your microphone? Thank you.
One of the interesting things about the examples Surya discusses, and he shows how the principles in the UN Guiding Principles can be readily applied to the types of decisions that corporations affected by the Hong Kong protests have to take. So the principles are clear, but then you have a practical issue in these sort of scenarios where it's essentially a crisis and you have to make decisions quickly. And so when the UN Guiding Principles were being conceived of, the idea of human rights due diligence was sort of informed by these examples of good practice. So a mining company will go and do a human rights or a social impact assessment before it is going to build a mine, but it's doing that in the context of planning something and taking decisions over a period of months or even years. And so you can sit down and you can reflect, what will the impacts be? How will we avoid the impacts? What should we do? Contrast that with what was happening in Hong Kong, where things are moving much faster. And one of the things that I've seen practicing in business and human rights is, and particularly in the United States and Western Europe, as a result of experiences like the Arab Spring and other crises, you see large corporations where the policy about human rights is now also supplemented by expertise within the company. So you see a minority of companies where there is a senior manager who is human rights counsel, or who is, somebody who's responsible for the human rights policy and therefore gets involved in the decision making. And I don't think we see that so much yet in Asia. So I'm not aware of anyone in Asia, for example, holding that type of position or title. And so really the question to Surya is, how can that sort of change in terms of corporate governance? What can be done in Asia that would accelerate that type of change in the mindset of a corporation, that we need to have this capacity? We can't just have a human rights policy. We need people within the company who understand what the implications of that are and can communicate effectively with the other decision makers in the company about what we should do when we're in a crisis situation.
One more question.
Thank you so much for the talk, Professor Deva. I have a question regarding the MTR case. Hinging on the 3 pillars in the UN guiding principles, protect, respect, and remedy. As a protesters, who have to walk to the protest site, how can I seek redress to the MTR? And actually, the same question applies to other companies that's complicit in human rights violations instead of committing human rights violations. Thank you.
Thank you for the questions, and I will deal with them in the same order. So I think there is, I did not cover in my talk, but there is definitely a role for customers and even investors and students to put pressure on businesses to respect human rights, including the UN guiding principles. But I think the difference is that earlier the typical or the traditional approach is what we call naming and shaming, that you name and shame and you boycott. And I think that is still happening. And I'm not saying that approach is not relevant or we should not do that. But the guiding principles also try to shift a little bit and say that instead of just doing naming and shaming, you should also try to engage with businesses. And that could be knowing and showing. Companies should know first how they are causing adverse impact, and then should show how they are trying to mitigate the adverse impact. And I think here sometimes I also feel that these companies, in my presentation today, MTR and Cathay Pacific, they perhaps do not fully understand the adverse impact they're causing on the other stakeholders. They're only looking at a very narrow set of stakeholders. So they're not fully informed. So I would say, before you start boycotting, why don't you first write a letter and seek a meeting and engage with the company first? So naming and shaming can be a useful tool, but I would also say that try to engage with the company. So consumers, consumer associations, investors, students' bodies, can you collectively write and try to engage with the companies? And if they don't respond, of course, naming and shaming could definitely be an option. Anthony, I think the practical challenges you're highlighting are real. But because of technology, I mean, let us say I'm Cathay Pacific, and suddenly I've been invited to come to Beijing, and they tell me that you have to fix it by tomorrow, right? So how do I do human rights due diligence, which I have not done so far? So I think your second question, or perhaps the second or the question that you're asking, has a part response to the first question, right? So if you have in-house expertise already, that would allow such a company to take an immediate ad hoc response which is consistent with UN guiding principles. Because that in-house expertise would give you the idea, these are the options for us, A, B, C, D, and we will do the consultation in detail later, but that's how we're going to do it, right? So this is kind of an emergency situation. That's what doctors do in the hospital, right? So sometimes there's no time to do any test. You have to immediately act on, and then you go for the test. At the same time, technology can be used in a positive way, right? So if a company wanted, they could have just done a survey with their employees and give them 10 hours. These are the 3 options. That is what the pressure is. These are the 3 options for us. What do you think we should do? What are the alternatives, right? So I think it is not impossible to do due diligence also quickly, because technology can be used effectively. How do we encourage companies to engage more people who are not merely thinking of the profit maximization or the legal landscape, but also thinking of normative standards like UN guiding principles? And I think here, I hope these case studies would be a lesson for them, internal reflection, and they would learn that they cannot, because if you look at the experience, MTR is not better off now, what they have done, in my view. Cathay Pacific is not better off. Look at their scandal about the oxygen bottles. The morale of the staff is absolutely low, right? So even if they're able to comply with the Beijing regulations, the company is suffering. And it was supposed to suffer anyway because the customers are not coming to Hong Kong fly, right? So it could have taken a different approach, in my view, and hopefully they will learn from this. Seeking redress under the UN Guiding Principle is the difficult one, right? Because these are not legally binding. There are options, though. One option is you can, I switch on my hat, you can complain to the UN Working Group. So that option is there, and that complaint is not always taken, it's not always effective. But in the past, when we have written letters to the companies have responded positively, some of them, and they requested a meeting with us and wanted to understand how can we operate differently. So that option is there. But I would also say we need to explore the legal options, right? So let us say Cathay Pacific. Can we sue Cathay Pacific for misrepresentation? Because they have a code of conduct, and they are saying they are following it. Are they following it, or they are not following it? And many companies are being sued when they say on their website they're doing ABC, but in practice they're not doing it. So can lawyers and law students be creative and think of the contract-based, constitutional law-based, the SDO-based, and other statutory-based discrimination and tort law discrimination, and try to connect those dots. But of course, there are also possibilities of making a complaint to what we call as national contact point. Like Cathay has connections with Swire. Swire is in the UK, and UK is an OECD country. So it's possible to make a complaint to the NCP, National Contact Point, in UK, that Swire and Cathay Pacific are in breach of the OECD guidelines. So there are a number of options. I'll be happy to talk bilaterally if you really have that interest. But it's a challenge, but there are options. Thank you.
Other questions? Yes.
Thanks for the talk. I'd like to know more about how we can make use of overseas laws and policies, for example, national action plans of other countries, or concluding observations given by treaty bodies to other countries to promote human rights in Hong Kong. Thanks.
Yes. One more? Oh, yes.
Thank you for your comments. In a world where cynicism is increasing, because even where you have binding legal principles, oftentimes they can be violated without any consequences. I was wondering what your thoughts are about kind of severing the kind of opposition that's created between kind of companies that want to engage in profit-seeking behavior, maximizing profits, versus looking at human rights considerations. Sometimes in the discourse, they're opposing, where all of the things that you would do, steps you would take to protect the human rights of your customers, the human rights of your employees, or within your supply chains, increase costs. Consultation takes time. All of these things won't really have an impact on the feedback loop or the incentive structure unless consumers are making decisions that aren't solely based on the price of the eventual product. So my question for you is about kind of how can we make consumer choice more about, also what companies are doing to protect human rights. And maybe this doesn't only mean boycotting the companies that are getting it wrong, but how can consumers reward companies that are making decisions that protect human rights?
Thank you. Thank you for these questions. Excellent questions. So let me follow the same order in which they were posed to me. Yes, so the national action plans of other countries could be relevant. So in the context of Hong Kong, I think one country that comes to mind is UK, for instance. They already have a national action plan in which they also have a specific policy about human rights defenders, in fact. So the UK government is committed to support human rights defenders anywhere in the world if there's a connection with the UK government, right? So then we can argue that these protesters, some of them, those who are not violent and all that, they are definitely human rights defenders. So the responsibility and the policy commitment of the UK government is directly engaged in those particular situations. I would also give a concrete example of Chinese government. They don't have a national action plan yet, but in the recent UPR, Universal Periodic Review cycle, the Chinese government openly said that we want our companies and our government to follow the UN Guiding Principles. They have said it officially in black and white in Geneva in the Human Rights Council. Now the question is, can you put it to them? That, okay, this is what you're saying. And in the context of Hong Kong SAR, when you're issuing these regulations and putting this pressure, how do you reconcile with that? So I think definitely in terms of advocacy, this argument could be made. In terms of engagement, and the meeting is, I think this is the community engagement this afternoon, right? So Carrie Lam should be asked this question because she can then convey this to Beijing, right? It is part of her responsibility under basic law to convey this. But there are definitely those openings that can be used if we are aware of those openings. Then there was a question about MTR not responding to complaint and all this. So, of course, it could be that they are not aware of the UN Guiding Principles, though on their website they talk about sustainability and CSR and all this. So I think, I don't know if a collective action may be more helpful, but if it is not helpful, then we might need to do something else which will force them to listen to us. And that is where the trade unions could play a role, or filing cases could become relevant. And so I think we need to get their attention, right? And I think to get their attention, what we call is pressure points. So one needs to identify what are the pressure points for this company that we want to engage with, right? So pressure points for each company are different. I give you a very simple example to answer your question. It's a concrete case. I will not name the company, but there were these farmers growing flowers in Kenya. And there were many women workers who were involved in the industry, and there was a huge issue about sexual exploitation there. And the company was not listening. So what this Kenyan NGO did, they collaborated with a civil society actor in the UK, where those flowers were being sold. So this CSO in London stood outside supermarkets with a placard that don't buy flowers tainted with sexual harassment. So 5 people just stood there, and then the company in Kenya started listening. That is called pressure point. So for every company, there are pressure points. And I think people need to identify those pressure points. Then the company would listen. I think the last point is about, I think you're absolutely right. I think I'm not a great fan of making this argument that there's a business case for human rights. There is in some cases. But if there was a business case, unqualified, absolute in every case, we don't need to be here. I would be writing on something else in my office. I will not be coming to give this talk. Companies would be respecting human rights and making more money. So in some cases, there is no business case for human rights, but you still need to do it. So in my view, UN Guiding Principles are beyond the business case. These are the things you must do as a precondition of doing business, even if that means earning less profit. But I think what you also mentioned is relevant in terms of raising awareness about consumers and investors. So I'm a professor or speaking here and talking about all good things. When I go to taste, as a consumer, I should also behave nicely and in line with what I'm saying in this room. If I'm investing in a company, I do not have a right to get profit on my investment. I merely have an expectation. And their expectation should also be reconciled with this whole idea. Because the system that we have in the world is completely collapsing. The free market economy and the profit maximization. It is not helping. It's not working for everyone. So you have a system which creates a Bill Gates, and then the Bill Gates is donating everything to his foundation. But why do we create a system which lets him make so much money and the bottom of the pyramid suffering? So these are fundamental questions, but I think we should be asking these fundamental questions to change anything. Thank you.
Thank you very much. We are unfortunately out of time, but I'd just like to thank Professor Deva for the very clear, excellent overview of what businesses could be doing or should be doing in order to act consistently with the UN guiding principles. And I also very much appreciate your practical proposal. Dare I say, realistic proposals for the way forward in the current context in relation to the particular cases that you've discussed in Hong Kong. And also your call for all of us to think creatively about how we can be part of the efforts to persuade, educate companies about these issues. So thank you very much. And thank you all for coming today.